Hello, I'm Toycat and welcome back to another geography video. Today I wanted to talk about borders and continue on my series where I talk about every single border that a country does have, and I wanted to do this not only because I find borders fascinating, but I also think it's a really good way to explain a country's geopolitical position and the kind of place it has in the world in relation to its neighbours and why neighbours might share disputes. And I figured let's bring this series to the Iberian Peninsula and talk about Spain, not only because it has some of the world's weirdest borders, the world's most interesting borders, but also the world's most surprising, because a lot of people, if you were to ask them how many, borders does Spain have, they'd be like two, one with Portugal and one with France. And if they know Andorra, they'd be like, oh yeah, it borders 3 countries. But the truth is, Spain actually borders 5 separate countries, and not in terms of like territories. Spain right here has 5 separate international borders with 5 separate countries. And those 5, interesting, surprising borders come with them the world's oldest border that can be, traced back to a treaty that is still in use to this day. It's over 700 years old. They also have the world's second oldest border that can be traced back to a treaty that is still in use to this day. They have one of the world's most surprising borders because it kind of happened by accident, and it's also the world's shortest. They have the EU's longest internal border. They have one of the very few exclaves in Europe, and finally they have the only example of a territory switching hands between 2 countries every 6 months. So let's talk about all those weird border anomalies that happen in Spain in today's video. Hopefully you'll enjoy this. It's going to be one of the weirdest ones, but let's get straight into it, and let's start by talking about the Spain-France border, or the Spanish-French border, the border between 2 pretty major European powers. And I find whenever you have 2 huge countries next to each other, you have to question why did it get that way? Why did one of them not try against the other's territory? And the simple explanation here is that even though France and Spain share a huge border, they did actually settle it a long time ago, and it is a pretty easily defendable border from both sides. And yeah, the border actually starts all the way here in Iran, because it's a pretty normal border, easy to explain for most of it. But the further west you get, the weirder things get, because the Iran border, with the French equivalent town on the other side, is a really weird one, because the river between the 2 countries is divided in a really strange way. Because most countries, when they have a river divided between the two of them, they have it go right the way down the middle, right? So that way half the water belongs to France, half the water belongs to Spain, and that's what they do with most of this river right here until it reaches the edge of the sea, where, as you can see, there's a little portion that belongs exclusively to Spain. All of the water, all of it right up to the coast of France, this is Spanish territory right here. But then all of this bay right here belongs to France instead, which is, again, super weird and wacky thing, even almost cutting off the Spanish airport, and then it goes right back down the middle, which means you have this weird situation where for any boat or ship to get through here, they have to go through at least Spain and France once. They have to cross from one country into the other and then back, which is just, kind of needless, but it's a weird little fact about the French-Spanish border. It also means that the airport right here, it's a small regional airport, San Sebastian. Half of the, ways of getting out here, basically, if they want to take off northbound, they have to go into France for some amount of airspace, or they have to land via France. So yeah, very weird airport, very weird border, but it gets even weirder because the strangest example of an international border being done on a river comes with Islas de los Faisanes, basically Pheasant Island. By the way, this is the weirdest border in the world, but it's for the least interesting island. Let me show you this island, by the way. It's just the dullest island in the world, but it is the example of the world's weirdest border because it is one which switches hands every 6 months. So what is the cause behind that? And it's one I had to look into because I was like, really? It switches hands every 6 months? And yeah, basically because of a treaty signed in the 1600s, the Treaty of the Pyrenees, the French and Spanish had to agree their proper border because a lot of the border was kind of unofficial because it took place over natural land barriers. And when they officially signed into law their official, long-standing border from there on out, they wanted to make some grandstand about, like how friendly and cooperative the 2 countries were. So they took an island which was perfectly between the 2 of them. Again, you can see right here, there's a pretty fair Spanish and a pretty fair French claim to it, and they decided to sign the treaty on this island. And alongside just signing the treaty here, that's a nice gesture by itself, they also decided that every 6 months, as a gesture of friendship, they would hand the island back and forth. So for the first 6 months of the year, until the 31st of June, so not long left now, this border will change so that France, so that France owns the border, because for the first 6 months it's owned by Spain, and for the second 6 months of the year, it's owned by France. Very weird situation, not found anywhere else in the world, and the reality behind it is it's just an impractical island. It's a useless island that can't be settled in any way, because look at the territory. The island, the area of the island is 0.0006 kilometers squared. The population is 0, and it's basically it's eroding too. It's basically a worthless island that's just a fun little like friendship thing. And because neither side allows their populations to do anything with the island outside of major events, it basically is just an unsettled island that will eventually fall away. But for now, it is one of the very few borders which has to be amended every 6 months, which sucks for map makers, but it's kind of cool for people who like borders, like me. So with that said, we'll follow the border a little bit further along here, because as you can see, the border mostly follows this river until it hits the, the mountains, which lead into the Pyrenees, because as you might guess from the name, the Treaty of the Pyrenees, most of the French-Spanish border takes place along the Pyrenees mountains. So you'll see this pretty clearly when you look at the map, like, oh yeah, it is pretty hilly and then pretty mountainous here. And also if you look at pretty much any of the border crossings, because there is a lot of crossings between France and Spain, you'll still see, to this day, some border posts on both sides. And these are not actively used border posts, but if you look right here, you can see just up ahead there is the French-Spanish, or this is actually the French customs industry. They, they'll levy customs on any goods coming in. And yeah, although it's not used anymore because France and Spain are both in the EU, it was used until very recently, 1986, if I'm not mistaken, when Spain and Portugal both joined the EU together, and they, kind of abolished, external borders and external tariffs, etc. But for the longest time, you had to, again, go through a border both times you left, and because there's a lot of border towns, like this one right here, seriously, there's a house there, then there's a house over here, there'd be this really interesting situation where, again, you had to cross the border, but people would still be willing to do it. And the reason people would still be willing to cross this border, again, both ways, you have to go through it, then you have to go back through it, the reason this would be done is because of the fact that Spain has much cheaper goods, especially, highly taxed goods, such as alcohol, such as, cigarettes, such as any duty-free thing like that, shopping, even grocery shopping, which means if you look at any town which exists half on the French side, half on the Spanish side, all of the commercial stuff, so a bar, a restaurant, a shopping mall, a supermarket, a convenience store, all this stuff is done on the Spanish side, whereas on the French side, there's pretty much nothing. There's a hotel, and then there's a gourmet grocery store. So yeah, you can kind of see that happen because, again, when you have two countries, there's kind of arbitrage that happens where most people in France can't drive to Spain, but if you live right on the border, you might as well drive there and do your weekly shop and get some alcohol and import it that way. So yeah, just a fun thing about the border between France and Spain. Nowadays, people still cross it, but it's a lot easier, and it's just one of those interesting points that, like, when it comes to border regions, you almost need to have separate rules just to stop stuff like that happening. But let's, move on to the other few examples of border, because again, every now and then it briefly goes back to a river before you get to the midpoint in the border between France and Spain, roughly speaking, in my opinion. That's how I see it, at least, because when you reach Andorra, you get this weird situation where the two countries split. So as you can see, France and Spain stop bordering each other and instead start bordering Andorra. So Andorra is a micro country in Europe. It's one that so few people know about that there's a whole myth about a man from Andorra that got locked up in Japan. Read it sometime. Until I learned Andorra was a country, I was like, wow, a country between France and Spain, how wacky. But yeah, Andorra is a real country. It's not a pretend one that you have to lie about in Japan. And basically, it's a country that exists mostly because France and Spain, in the same way this island is effectively just a condominium, Pheasant Island, in the same way that that's a condominium, Andorra started as a condominium and still kind of is between France and Spain. It's an independent country, but two of the princes, one of them is a Spanish or Catalan, prince, and one of them is the current president, or formerly the King of France, which means one of the princes of Andorra, this little micro country, is actually Emmanuel Macron. I find that wacky. But yeah, the border between these two countries is actually, as in Spain and Andorra, is actually the oldest border in the world. This was, this goes all the way back to the Peerage of Andorra, 1278, when they officially acknowledged for the first time in a document that this would be, co-territory of both France and Spain. And because of that, 1278 is the oldest any border has, was first signed and then still exists to this day. And it basically just existed because, again, they were torn between Catalan people and French people. And the long story short is they decided to become basically influenced by both. They're almost like a puppet state that's willingly a puppet state. And it's a confusing situation, but that's Andorra. And that is the Andorra-Spanish border, the oldest border in the world, which, by the way, fun fact, is technically an external EU border on both sides, but the reality behind it is that, Andorra kind of acts like they're in the EU in a few interesting ways. So if we go back to the border right here, you can see how they put up a little sign like, oh yeah, we're in the EU, look, we've got the European flag right there, Andorra. So yeah, there's like official border crossing on both sides, but it's very lax because realistically Andorra is landlocked, and Andorra is very, very friendly and very cooperative with both France and Spain. So there you go, fun fact about the border. Next up, we have one of Europe's only exclaves, because right here you see the town of Libya, which is actually entirely surrounded by France. So what's the deal with this town right here? I had to look into it because, again, when you see something like this, you're like, well, that's kind of weird. And the story, the official story, is that what happened way back when is when France was taking a few towns of Spain to make the official agreement, they decided in the agreement that France could have all of the villages in this area to make the border straight. However, after the treaty was signed, they're like, well, That doesn't include Libya, because Libya is a ville, it's not a village, because it was the capital of the region, and officially, legally speaking, somehow that stood up, and that means that there's a small town right here, which is an exclave of Spain inside of France. It's a very weird situation. It's mostly fine because they use the same currency now, but during World War II, this was like a serious tactic where, oh yeah, France could have just like surrounded it and occupied them and taken it back. They never did, and it's just become this friendly situation of like, look, you can be in Spain, then you can be in France, then you can be in Spain, and then be in France again. Isn't that wacky? And it's also quite an interesting area because if you look around here, you can see how a lot of the town names are just really weird, like the town of Ur, the town of the town of, there's a bunch of weird ones, Gur, Alp, Das, and my favourite one, place you've got to try living somewhere is Bar. This sounds like a nice little bar, found right over here. So yeah, basically, weird town names, weird border, and one of the only exclaves found in Europe to this day, Kaliningrad being another notable version, as well as Croatia. But yeah, one of the few exclaves that exists because someone signed a treaty wrong, and you bet that they're probably in trouble for that now. But yeah, that is the French-Spanish border, mostly covered by the Pyrenees Mountain, mostly covered by natural geographic features, and that's the reason why France and Spain, despite being major European powers, nowadays France has a slightly higher balance of power, but Spain, obviously in some ways, has its own powers. But nowadays they wouldn't ever invade each other. But the reason they didn't historically is because it is quite hard to invade across a mountain range and rivers, and they have natural borders, and it keeps France safe and it keeps Spain safe from each other, which is a good thing. It's good not to go to war with each other, isn't it, Europe? So yeah, it's also worth noting that interestingly enough, the French-Spanish border is connected by high-speed rail. There is TGV services, that's the French high-speed trains across the French-Spanish border in two places, on both over here and over there, whereas Spain and Portugal are not connected by high-speed rail because, we've gone over two of the countries now, Andorra, which has the world's oldest border, and now we're going to talk about Portugal, which has the world's second oldest border with Spain. So yeah, Portugal's only border is actually this one right here, and therefore this is also the video on Portugal's all of their borders, because yeah, Portugal actually shares just one border, which is the one with Spain. It is the EU's longest internal border that is uninterrupted. I found that to be a fun little fact, and yeah, because of that, this huge border was agreed all the way back in the 1200s and has somehow remained in place to this day. Interestingly enough, though, it might be amended eventually, and it likely is, because there's not much you can really say about this border besides like, well, Portugal and Spain, the big question everyone has when they look at the map that, you're not allowed to say this one out loud is like, so again, if Spain's there and Portugal's there, and Spain is that much bigger than Portugal, why did Spain never invade and try and take Portugal? There was a huge Spanish unification, and that's a thing that happened. Why did the unified Spain never take Portugal and make it like an autonomous province? Like, it kind of just makes sense. Look at the size of all the other countries. It seems like they'd go together. And first of all, the answer to that is like, well, it's kind of offensive to Portuguese people to say they'd just be absorbed by Spain. But the realistic truth behind it is if you go back to when Portugal was first formed, Portugal formed before any of the smaller Spanish states, before they unified, and because of that, Portugal and Castile, it was, again, back in the 1200s, they, made a formal border, and for the longest time during their history, Portugal was actually quite level with Spain because it had overseas territories, such as Brazil, and even when it wasn't level with Spain, they did have some fighting, but they usually had alliances involved, and yeah, those two things, combined with the fact that it does contain mostly natural borders, and combined with the fact that they are pretty friendly, they have a lot in common. Fun fact, actually, even though Portuguese and Spanish are entirely separate languages, Spanish people and Portuguese people can vaguely understand each other. As I understand it, it works a little bit better. Portuguese people can understand Spanish a little bit better than Spanish people can understand Portuguese people, but they can still just about get the gist of what each other is saying, which again, a wacky thing that I can't experience as an English speaker, but you can experience if you live in Spain or Portugal, and yeah, like I said, their border mostly follows natural-ish formations. You'll see it follows a lot of rivers, only about half the border is that, but again, it means that it's just about defendable. It means that because both countries are familiar, and because they've lasted so long separate, there's not a strong movement to really unify in any way, and it's not something you'll ever see, despite a lot of people looking at it and being like, someday they should get together. The truth is, even though they might seem like they have similarities, they also have a lot of differences. It's that weird thing where like, oh yeah, we're really similar, except all the ways we're different, which is a lot of ways, and that kind of defines their relationship. Speaking of their relationship, again, their border, it's a really boring one to go over. It has the same thing as France and Spain, because like, oh yeah, if you look at any border point crossing, you can see the same kind of checkpoints. We got into the wrong place there. You can see the same checkpoints where you have to, again, you're meant to be checked for your goods and stuff. However, since Spain and Portugal both joined the EU EU, or the EEC as it was known back then, the same time in 1986. Both the borders were just abolished at the same time, and now you can freely go between the two, and so can goods. Isn't that wonderful? Look at that. Spain, Portugal, no border controls whatsoever. Sometimes they actually do put up border controls. It's been like 4 separate occasions, but mostly no border controls between Spain and Portugal. And it's interesting that Spain and Portugal managed to have such good relations despite the huge territorial dispute that they actually do have. So it's funny because this is the world's second oldest border that is still in place to this day, but Portugal doesn't agree with that. And it's you might find it weird that like it's 700 years old. How can you not agree with it? But it actually comes down to a pretty interesting territorial dispute in the realm of Olivenza. So Olivenza is this town right here. And the surrounding areas are also part of the same dispute because Portugal believes that the border includes Olivenza inside of Portugal, whereas Spain believes that this is their territory. And it is currently owned by Spain, and they de facto control it, and they ban the Portuguese language. So it's effectively a part of Spain. But when you look into the history of why it is, because it seems like Portugal's being petty and just claiming something that doesn't belong to them. But the truth is that in the Treaty of Vienna, 1815, exciting treaty by the way, it's a thrilling read. But in the Treaty of Vienna, they officially had an agreement where Spain had to give this town to, or they had to agree to be mediated with this town going to Portugal eventually, and that mediation never came because eventually, Portugal wanted to speed up the process, so they just occupied Uruguay, and then Spain was like, well, if you're occupying Uruguay, you don't get your town of Olivenza. And Olivenza, the reason it's never called disputes is because it's not that tactically important. It's a town of 15,000 people with no hugely important natural resources. It's just kind of like Portugal feels like they earned it. There's a treaty that says they can have it, and Spain feels like it's been theirs for 200 years, so how about we just keep it? And it just doesn't, to this day, it doesn't cause real disputes between the two countries, which is nice, because most, big areas like that cause some big issue. But in the case of Spain and Portugal, they just kind of agree that, like, we'll agree to disagree with this on this one, and in Spain's case that works because they currently do control Olivenza. But if you look at any official Portuguese government map, it'll either claim that as their own, or it'll be very ambiguous about that. So yeah, world's second oldest border has a border dispute. I think that's kind of wonderful, and it's a sign of things to come with the next border we're going to talk about, because again, you can see the border's pretty straightforward with Spain and Portugal, but the Spanish-UK border is one that you might be surprised of, because Spain does in fact border the UK. So Gibraltar is one of the few UK territories which is a part of the UK in almost every single way. Again, there's a lot of overseas territories that are kind of not the UK and kind of are, but Gibraltar is a part of the UK, it is a part of the EU, and interesting enough, if you look at the EU referendum, the result across the rest of the UK was, 51.9% to leave, but the result in Gibraltar was 97% in favour of staying in the EU, because they have a direct border with another EU state, which is Spain. So the Spanish-Gibraltar border is a very, very tiny border. Seriously, look at this border right here. It's like, okay, just over a kilometre long. I mean, if you put it like that, it's 1.2 kilometres long from one side to the other. If you include the sea, it's longer. But, it's a very, very short border. And the reason this exists, the reason this is a part of the UK, because I'll be honest, when I first learned about Gibraltar, I'm like, how did we, because I'm from the UK, a lot of people think I'm American somehow, but how did we get a hold of that? How is that a thing? That's the UK? Okay, if that's the line. But yeah, the reason that Gibraltar is owned by the UK is because in the 1700s there was a treaty that was signed. Spain was kind of on the weak, and one of the things they agreed to give away was Gibraltar to the UK, and they're really not happy about the fact that they did. And I can understand, like, this is right here on Spanish territory. It's also a really heavily defendable heavily defendable place. It is called the Rock of Gibraltar, or just the Rock, and you can control all of the trade that goes through the Suez Canal, and therefore from Asia to Europe from this point, because there's a very thin point between Morocco and between Spain. This is where a lot of the world's trade goes through. It's incredibly crowded, and because of Gibraltar's strategic position, the UK kind of had a say over all of that, which is both a good thing and also a bad thing. So yeah, Gibraltar and the Spain have a very short border. It's a cause of contention, and especially during the Franco years, when the dictator was in charge, they would make it really tricky for people to get past one way or the other. Nowadays, it just kind of goes up and down based on like how they're feeling. It's easier to get across than it was before, but because the UK is not in Schengen, there is still border checks, there is still a whole thing, and also their border is like right on an international airport, which I find should just be a wacky little thing I'm going to throw out there. So yeah, basically, it's a mess, it's a confusing situation, it's a weird place for the UK to be, but because of a treaty, we're keeping it, and Spain every now and then says like, why don't we make it a condominium? And it's like, that's a good-ish idea, I guess, but we'll see how that goes in the future. Basically, a lot of people Gibraltar is not a negotiating point, and I don't imagine it will be one, but you might see that come up in the future, because it is a very weird place for a UK part to be. So let's finally talk about the Spanish and the Moroccan border, because again, when we're talking about Spain's borders, you're thinking about the mainland, the Iberian Peninsula, because that's where the 4 other borders are. But Spain actually has some territories in North Africa. These aren't even just territories; they are strictly a part of the Spanish state, and have been since around about the 1500s, or a little bit longer for some of them. And these are very interesting because Ceuta, this territory right here, very, very edge of Morocco, belongs to Spain, and Morocco claims it. But this is one of the interesting territories because this is Spain. It's EU, it's Schengen, it's all the other stuff. They use the euro as their currency. If you can cross this border right here, you are officially in Europe, and you can't be. If you cross the border, then you can claim asylum. There's a whole system about that. So basically, this border right here is the most militarized in terms of like keeping people out in the world. Because if people can get over it, that means they have a free reign. People set up camp around the border just so they can climb over it. And it's so crazy when you look at the fortifications, because there's like layers of defense. There's a wall, there's another wall, there's another wall. Basically, they want to. There's one of the places where they really want to keep people out is this border right here, because it is strict access into Europe. And I don't necessarily understand the exact reason why you'll let people into your country just because they can climb a wall, and why it's okay not to let them into your country just because they can't climb the wall. It seems like a really ridiculous system where like, oh yeah, people who climb the wall, they're allowed in, and they generally go to the rest of Europe. If they can't climb over, then we don't have to deal with them. That seems to be the rule. And again, it's based on international treaties and the UN Convention on Refugees. It's a whole thing, but basically because of that, this border is the most militarized, and it's part of the Spanish-Moroccan border. There is also another 3 or 4 points depending on whether you count maritime borders, but if you scroll along the border a bunch more, you'll see there is Melilla, another huge city that belongs to Spain, claimed by Morocco as well. Spain claims it's theirs and has the same issue where it's right here, surrounded by Morocco, which was obviously previously a Spanish territory. There's also some islands found just over here. These are Spanish, technically speaking. Again, it's not so important because there's like nothing on them, but because they are Spanish, technically speaking, it is a Spanish island, and they are claimed by Morocco. And then finally, we have one of the weirdest examples of a border between two countries. Because as you look along the border right here, you'll be like, oh yeah, everything here looks pretty normal, right? And then you find the Spanish territory of this. I'm not going to attempt to say that, but you find the Spanish, territory of this, which is a part of Spain. And if you look at the border between this and Morocco, it is the world's shortest border, as far as I can tell, that is by land. It is an 80-meter border. You can run across left or right in this border in, like 10 seconds flat. It's a very, very short border. So, given that the border is so short, why is that the case? Why is this owned by Spain? And the long story short that I didn't realize when I last spoke about this border is that this border was set by Spain in the 1500s. It's belonged to Spain for hundreds of years, both before and after Moroccan independence, which is why Spain claims all this stuff. But in 1934, there was a huge sandstorm, and it swept enough sand here that it naturally formed a bridge between the island and the mainland, which means that the two countries accidentally ended up with a border. That's right, the shortest border in the world is an accident. It wasn't intended. It's just an island that eventually got a sand bridge with Morocco, and therefore, midway between them, in the old maritime boundary, as you can see right here, that's the island, that's the accidental sand bridge, they ended up with this border, which means that's why you can walk directly from Morocco into Spain. Obviously, you can't actually do that. There's like a lot of people that will stop you from doing that, but it's just kind of wacky. They're like, oh yeah, there's the restaurant and Cafe Ismail, there's Spanish, military-based stuff, and yeah, that's a thing you'll find because of the Spanish-Moroccan border. And there you go. That is Spain, and it's 5 separate borders. That is every single border that Spain does have. Spain is in this very interesting position, being in the Iberian Peninsula, and it takes advantage of it in a lot of good ways. It has a lot of islands, which are just used for tourism in a very good and positive way. And Spain as a whole, however, does have the problem of being a country which is entirely based both in the capital and around the edges. If you look at a population density map of Spain, it's like, oh yeah, everyone lives either on the islands, or they live at the coast, or they live in Madrid. There's very little else going on there, and because of that, I feel like that's one of the things Spain maybe will have, as a problem or solution going forwards. However, because it has so little in between, it has one of the longest high-speed rail networks in the world, so they've got a lot of like pros and cons that come with everything, and yeah, Spain is one of the countries in Europe that I feel like is widely recognized as being a good place to go, and therefore, if for some reason you watched a video about its borders as a recommendation on Spain, take this as a yes. I've been to Spain twice, I only melted one of those times, and would entirely recommend it. Also, just as a fun little thing, I know Catalonia, I don't want to really talk about in this video, if Catalonia goes independent, then Spain would actually have the same number of borders, because obviously they'd lose their border with Andorra, so I don't know, just a fun little thing there, in case someone down there's going to be like, oh, but Catalonia, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about it because, again, it's its whole own thing. And again, I'm not going to talk about Catalonia because it's looking like it's less likely to happen now, so that's a good thing. Anyway, with that said, there's everything I wanted to say about borders in Spain. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you liked it, then I'd recommend you check out the subreddit, reddit.com/r/toycat. Discuss the video there. Say anything you want to say. Got any questions? Got any answers? Got any corrections? All the stuff, reddit.com/r/toycat. And also, as always, there's a link to the other stuff you might want to check out, playlists, etc. And for now, you know, I'm just holding your time. That's rude of me, so I'll let you go now. Have a nice day. Goodbye. Second channel, don't care. I have to say it.